Hey then, Rabotza. Haven't seen you in about a week. It seems like, anyway. I think it is a week, to be exact. Let me see which Gemara we have here. Oh. How you doing, John? Shalom.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Okay, so we're on Daf Chav Beis, and we got up to the Mishnah on the bottom of Chav Beis Amud Aleph, and we know that just the basics, that two brothers, one of whom died without a child, and the other brother has a mitzvah of yibum, to marry his late brother's wife and to be making li'achiv shem. If, on the other hand, he doesn't want to, he's not interested in being miyabim her, then he has to give a chalitza to be mater her linase, that she can marry anyone she wants. Our Mishnah is going to clarify it's considered a brother to generate a need for yibum, a zikas yibum. And the Mishnah says the following: Mi sheyesh lo ach mikol makom. The Mishnah seems to be all-inclusive. Any brother whatsoever is enough to generate a zikas yibum. And the chiddush here is that even a mamzer, so it means that Reuven and Shimon are both children of the same father. However, let's say Shimon, who's the surviving brother, he's a mamzer. It means that his father had a relationship with a woman who is married, or some erva. So again, these two brothers, the late brother and the surviving brother, do not share the same mother. They come from two different mothers, but they share the same father. And the second one, the one who's surviving, is a mamzer because he was born through an erva relationship. Again, with the second woman. Again, the first brother, we'll call him Reuven, he came from a very fine marriage and so forth and so on. But Shimon, who was born from the same father as Reuven, but nevertheless, this was an illegal relationship. But nevertheless, Zokekes Eishes Ochi, Liyimum. Even though he's not a kosher, the mamzer, but nevertheless, he is a brother. And they do share the same father, and that's enough to generate a zikas yibum, which would mean that if he's the only brother, Mr. Mamzer, if you pardon the expression, that's what he is, he will give her chalitza. He can't be miyabim her because, as we discussed in great length, there's no yibum in the case of chayve lavin, and she cannot marry him because he's a mamzer, which is a chayve lav, maser yovel kol. But on the other hand, he has to give a chalitza because, as a brother, he generates a zikas yibum. And that's called achiv hu lechol tov. Now the Mishnah adds these four words. There must be some hidush, some extra extension of this law, namely that the mamzer is considered a full-fledged brother to his brother. And the Gemara is going to have to analyze, what are you coming to add over here by saying achiv hu lechol tov? And this is true for a mamzer. Now we go on to another situation. Let's say that the father, the common father of both the late Reuven and the surviving Shimon, had a relationship from which Shimon was born with a shivcha, or min hovedes kochavim. Now, biologically, Reuven and Shimon are brothers. They share the same father. Had Shimon's mother been Jewish, then although if she's an erva to the father, nevertheless, despite the fact that Shimon is a mamzer, but nevertheless, his father is his father. There's yichus. But if Shimon was born from a woman who is, let's take the extreme case, a non-Jewish woman, then the father could no longer claim yichus to his son because he had a relationship with a non-Jewish woman. Now, another option would be where he had a relationship with a shivcha, and the status of a shivcha knanis is somewhat like a giores, but she's not a full-fledged giores yet, and there's no yuchsin. He cannot claim that he's the father of the child from the shivcha. So in these cases, although Reuven and Shimon are biologically brothers through the same common father, but nevertheless they're not considered brothers al pi din because there's no yichus between Shimon and his biological father. Now the Mishnah goes on. Misha yeshlo ben mikol makom. Okay. Now the Mishnah is addressing a slightly different question, very similar but different. And that is the following. As we indicated, if Reuven dies, but he leaves a son, then there's no zikas yibum. Reuven's almana does not fall for yibum at all. She doesn't need chalitza or anything. She can just get married to anyone. But we have to determine whether the son is a biological son, and that's it, or he's miyuchas to his father. He's not just biologically his son, he's legally, according to the halacha, his son. And the Mishnah says, Misha yeshlo ben mikol makom. Any son that he had, which means that Reuven had a relationship with an erva, and this little boy was born from that erva relationship. He means the boy has the status of what? A mamzer, but nevertheless, when Reuven dies, his wife does not fall for yibum because he left his son, despite the fact that the son is a mamzer. And that's called ben mikol makom. And poter eishes aviv min hayibum. So therefore, the widow of the father of this mamzer does not fall for yibum to the brother of his father. Not only that, now the Mishnah goes into slightly detailed repercussions or implications of yichus, of the fact that the son, although he's a mamzer, is miyuchas after his father, and because he was born from a Jewish woman. You know, it's a little bit paradoxical in a sense, because when a man has a relationship with a non-Jewish woman or a shivcha, the violation is not as severe as had he had that same escapade with a Jewish woman, because she's an Erevatin. But yet, despite the fact that the creation of this child, so to speak, was through a more severe Isur, nevertheless it's his child. Why? Because the mother is a Jewish woman. So the yuchsin is not a yuchsin, or the lack of yuchsin, if you find, is not at all a reflection of the chumras ha'avera. And even though there's a less chomer avera in having a relationship with a shivcha or an avodas kochavim, nevertheless, as far as yuchsin is concerned, dafka in a violation that was more severe, that generated mamzeres, but with a Jewish mother, the child is miyuchas. And the yuchsin is not only to remove zikas yibum, but also as far as hakah and klala is concerned. Right? The Torah says that if a son wounds his father or curses his father, he's chayav mitzvah for that. And in this case, despite the fact that he's a mamzer, he'll be chayav mitzvah for hakah and klala. Chayav al makaso ve al kilalasa. And this is all apparently a sugya in Sanhedrin on Daf Pei Hey, interpreting the pasuk in Mishpatim. It says Makeh aviv ve'imo mos yumos, and then it says Mekalel aviv ve'imo mos yumos. And again, Maka Aviv means not that he just gave him a smack. That's bad enough. But he actually drew blood through a wound. And that's the famous shaila of, a son who's a surgeon, if he's allowed to operate on his father. And in the case of Klola, it requires what's called Klola B'Shem. He has to mention the holy name of God. Once again, the Mishnah adds this 4-word phrase that has to be interpreted. A general klal, obviously it's coming to include other dinim. So we don't have in front of us an exhaustive list. But if a man has a son who's his biological son, but through a non-Jewish woman, or in the case of a shivcha, who's somewhat of a Jewish woman, but as far as Yufsin is concerned, he doesn't. The father doesn't have any Yufsin with the son, and in such a case, even though he has a biological son, but nevertheless his wife will fall for Yibum to his brother. And even though this son is biologically his son, he's not Chayef HaHakah or Klola because there's no Yufsin. The Gemara says, Mikol Makom. The Mishnah says, Yeshlo Ach Mikol Makom. Lasuye Mai. Right, we interpret our Mishnah already. We get the cat is out of the bag, but the Gemara didn't know what we know, because we only know what's the part. Namely, that Mikol Makom means even a mamzer. Rabbi Yehuda Lasuye Mamzer. So the Mishnah is coming to be mechadish to me that a mamzer is miyuchas to its father, and therefore his father, there's no yibum because he has a ben. Or alternatively, if you're talking about 2 brothers and the second brother is a mamzer, then they are brothers, and therefore the mamzer will generate a zikas yibum. So the Gemara asks pshita, achivu. Why would I think otherwise? I mean, for all dinim, they are brothers, even though one is a mamzer. They share the same father. Was there some sort of a svara, the Gemara is asking, that as far as Yibum is concerned, the mamzer is not considered a brother to the late Reuven, and with Reuven's death, there would be no zikas Yibum that was generated because Shimon is a mamzer. They're not related. What was the Havamim? So the Gemara says, Ma'u de Tema. Now, in the Torah, in the Parsha of Yibum, in Parshas Kitese, it says, Ki yetru achim yachdav. Is the Torah adding something about upgrading the requirements of achva? Now, the Tema might think, Leilif achva mibnei Yaakov. So this is a parsha that we're almost about to get up to. When the Achim show up in front of the viceroy of Egypt, obviously they didn't know it was their brother Yosef. They said, Shnemasar avadecha achim anach b'nei Yaakov. We are 12 brothers, meaning we were originally 12 brothers. And that jacks up the standard for defining brotherhood. Achim, that same word achim, in the context of Bnei Yaakov, is used by the Torah in the context of Yibum, because in Yibum it says Ki yeshru achim yachdav. So the same word achim that appears in the parsha Bereshis of Bnei Yaakov appears in the parsha in Kitese of Yibum, and that gives us Gzeret Shava achim achim. Ma'alahal, and I would say just like in the case of the brothers of Yaakov, where the Torah calls them Achim, is Ksherim. They're all Nolad B'Kashrus from the four wives of Yaakov. Below Psulim, there's no Psul at all whatsoever in any of the Achim. Is Afkan. Now let's use the same word Achim here in the Pasuk Yeshu Achim Yachdav in Yibum, to jack up the standard and the requirements of the Achim that has to be ksherim below psulim. The Mishnah wants to tell me no. We're not going to be impressed by this Gzeirah Shava and derive a mistaken conclusion that Achim means Ksher, to the exclusion in Yibum and Zikas Yibum of Mamams. So the Gemara immediately asks, why are you rejecting this Gzeirah Shava? Wouldn't it make sense to say that the Torah implies Ki Yesh Achim Yachdav, that the mitzvah of Yibum applies to Achim of Bnei Yaakov, like the Bnei Yaakov are Achim. And therefore only a kosher would generate Zikas Yibum, but not a Mamzer. So the Gemara answers, Kevan Dila Inyon Yibum, Miftar Potar. Since, and now the Gemara is sort of jumping to the Sefer of that Mishnah. Remember, in the Sefer, we were talking about the status of a Ben. So it means that Reuven died and he left a biological son. And the question is, would that son pater the late Reuven's wife from Yibum? And the answer is, any Ben whatsoever, even if the Ben is a mamzer, is enough to pater up the Ashes Aviv, the wife of his father from Yibum. So already we see within the context of the mitzvah of Yibum that a mamzer is elevated to the status, in this case, of a Ben, and by analogy, in the case of an ach. Is therefore, says the Gemara here on Daf Chav Beis, Amid Beis, Mizkak Nami Zakik. That just like a mamzer removes Zikas Yibum in the case of a Ben, so too would a mamzer generate a Zikas Yibum in the case of an Ach. Now Rashi, on the top of the Amud, says, Afilu ein kan ach ela mamzer zeh. And I was trying to figure out, what is Rashi coming to be machadish, that this is the only brother that there is? I mean, obviously, if there are other brothers, or one other brother who's not a mamzer, there's nothing to talk about. The Chiddush Vad Mishnah is mikol makom, even if the only ach that exists on the face of the earth to be mezakek b'yibum is a mamzer, nevertheless she's kukul yibum, which means she needs chalitza from the mamzer. Not sure what Rashi was trying to convey here when he says that even though he's the only brother. It seems so obvious. Now, you may have noticed that I was turning a lot of pages here. Did you notice that? So I just want to show you what Masechet did over here. This is like show and tell here. John, you have a Masechet, right? So I don't have to show you this. I'll show it to the guys here. Take a look at this. I don't know why exactly they printed it here. I'm not 100% sure. But these are all diagrams which we're meant to understand the Shnios Larayos, and these pages here are to explain the diagram. And honestly, I was thinking, maybe, yeah, please. I was thinking that maybe we should take, maybe not today, but another day, and maybe a full morning's work, I don't know, and take a break and go through these diagrams with all their explanation. It would probably be a great chazara for a lot of what we did in the past. He has here first a whole discussion about krovos hasuris min Torah, which means an isakaris. Then he has krovos hasuris min rabbanim mishum shnios larayos, and then he goes into detail about certain relatives that are not included in the Gzeira of Shnios. He has a list of krovos that are subject to machlokes, where they're included under shnias larayos. And then there were those that everybody agree, hands down, there's no gzeira of shnias larayos. He has cases, categories of cases of krovos, where shnias larayos takes you ad infinitum, no matter how many generations. Then he has a whole bunch of krovos that shnios that is a suffix whether or not it has a hefsek or not, or machlokas whether it has a hefsek or not. Remember we spoke about a grandmother and a great grandmother. How far does it go back? All this here is, presented in diagram form with explanation. Okay, now the Gemara wants to know, what is this phrase, v'achiv l'chol davar? Achiv hu l'chol davar. L'mai hilchasa. What is this additional phrase in the Mishnah to tell you that a mamzer is considered his brother for all dinim? Liyarsha. The Gemara says, let's say that a brother, let's call him Ruvain, dies, and he has an estate. He has a brother named Shimon who is his biological brother, but he's a mamzer. And there are other Yarshim that would like to claim the estate. Our Mishnah is telling us, no, the mamzer will have rights to the estate. Now, again, we have to assume that the brother, meaning Reuven, who died, left no children. Because if he left a son, then the son gets first, what word should I use? First shot at the estate. Because the son is higher on there's a whole hierarchy of relatives. This one is the first, and if he's not around, there is no such brother. Then he goes to this and that, so going down. So in an issue between a brother and a son, the son will inherit. Okay, now there's no son. So Reuven died childless. He has a brother who's a mamzer, we call him Shimon. So I was wondering, okay, the Gemara is going to say now, Achiv l'chol davar, that Shimon will inherit his brother Reuven because Reuven left no children. Is that halach of Yerusha generated by the halach of Yibum? What I mean to say is that since Shimon is considered a brother to generate a zikas Yibum, such that Reuven's almana cannot get married without getting chalitza in this case, then that itself gives him rights to the Yerusha, to the estate. Or is it just two halachas that are parallel, that sort of mirror image themselves one to the other because it comes from the same source, meaning the same fundamental principle that a mamzer is a share, but he is a karov. And again, going back to my first possibility, it's not just that the second halach of Yerusha parallels the halach of Yibum, but it is generated by the halach of Yibum. The reason why Shimon has claims to the estate of Reuven is because he generates a zikas Yibum. And I say this because zikas Yibum is halacha in Yerusha. We know this, that if Shimon is the Yavam, then above and beyond the mitzvah of Yibum, he also has monetary rights to inherit his late brother. And if that be the case, then when we say that Liyarsho, even though he's a mamzer, he still inherits his brother's estate, that's a result of his status as a Yavam. The Yavam has rights of Yerusha. The only tricky thing is that he's a mamzer, therefore there is no Yibum. But the zikas Yibum, he's going to have to give a chalitza, but it could be that the zikas Yibum itself gives him the status of a Yavam. I was looking here in the Masechet, I didn't find anything.
But if there was another brother, and there was no let's say it's not a brother that died. There's the mamzer, there's the before, and there's another brother, and the mamzer before inherits without any kind of Yibum situation.
Wait, let me get it again. Who died? A kosher or a mamzer?
Just take one person. Yeah.
Reuven.
So
Reuven, call him Reuven. Reuven died.
The kosher died.
Died.
His oldest son is a mamzer.
Right.
Inherits. There's no Zika. There's not.
Right. That's for sure. But I'm asking, I'm not sure where you're taking me, Jeff, but I'm asking a different question. What happens if Reuven dies and he has no children? So there are two questions. Question number one, which is explicitly addressed here by Agamar, black and white. What if Shimon is available for Yerusha and unfortunately he's a mamzer? So the answer is he will inherit his brother. Now we can ask another question. What if there's Shimon and Levi? Levi is a kosher and Shimon is a mamzer. Do the two brothers now split the estate? Or do we say no? You know what? Levi has a superior status if we compare it to that of Shimon, because Levi has an option of what? Yibum, whereas Shimon doesn't have the option of Yibum. That's what I'm wondering about. Is Shimon's status here as a Yoresh generated by, it's a result of his status as a Yavam? Okay, fine, you're a Yavam. Why are you a Yavam? Because we need desperately your chalitza to be matter. But if we don't need your chalitza, we have the real Yavam. Will the real Yavam please stand up?
Kosher.
And that's the kosher Yavam, that's Levi, then Shimon is out. I don't know. He offers me nothing in the footnotes here. I was kind of disappointed. You have anything in your Gemara by any chance? I doubt it, but. All right, let's go on then, unless you find something very top. Then it says litamelo. And what that means is that let's say these two brothers are Kohen. And the law is that a Kohen is metame himself, he desecrates his kedushas kahuna for the sake of his close relatives. And now Shimon, although he's a biological brother of Reuven, and with Reuven's death, Shimon is coming to ask us as a Kohen, should he be metame to bury his brother? And the answer is he's a full-fledged brother. And therefore, l'tami law, this will override his status as a Kohen. But this doesn't make any sense, what I just told you. Why? He says here, Im Adam shu mamzer makes. You see, this was like your case before, Jeff, where Reuven was the mamzer, meaning the brother that died was the mamzer. Because I'll tell you, my construct is really ridiculous. It's totally a misnomer. If the surviving brother Shimon is the mamzer, then there's no issue about two. He's completely out of the ballpark as far as kahuna is concerned. You can't have a psul kol, which means a mamzer, being kosher l'kahuna. So all these issues about burial are irrelevant. But let's flip it around the other way. The late Reuven was a Kohen. I'm sorry. The late Reuven, who's a Kohen, was a mamzer. And now Shimon is a full-fledged kosher Kohen, we have to answer his question, determine whether or not he's metame himself for the burial of Reuven, his brother who's a mamzer. And the answer is, achiv l'chol davar, he's considered your brother for all dinim, and you will be metame him and violate your kedushas kahuna by being metame yourself because he is your brother. So when the Torah says at the beginning of Parshas Emor, Amor laKohanim lenefesh lo yitama b'amav ki im l'sheroa karov elav ulachiv. Again, we're skipping words, but just to point out the word ach is on the list, and the Kohen will be metame for the burial of his brother. That will apply even though his late brother was a mamzer. And that's what the Mishnah is coming to Mechayish to me when it says, Achiv hu lechol davar. And again, I'm wondering out loud, why is he Matame? I mean, it's a very strange situation. He's a mamzer. But since we already determined that he's considered an ach, then when we read the parsha in Emor that obligates an ach to be Matame himself, for an ach, the Kohen is Matame himself, then it applies even if the late Ruvain HaKohen was a mamzer. And you bury him. You know, this is just an emotional comment that's worthless, but I'll say it anyway, just because it makes me feel a little comfortable, so to speak. The Gemara that we're learning, you know, I always felt bad for the mamzer. You know, he's not at fault at all. What was the shuldig? What is he guilty of? His father is to blame. Why should he suffer all these dinim? So it really warms my heart. So it's just an emotional comment to see that the Torah doesn't exclude a mamzer totally. He'll inherit his brother. When he dies, his brother will bury him. And as far as Zikas Yibum is concerned, he's considered a brother, and she needs chalitza. And we'll see other dinim as we go along. So we have, you know, a paradoxical sort of very, tightrope situation where on one end, his yichus is really down in the dumps again, and he'll suffer from it. He can marry a mamzeres, he can marry giores, he can't marry bas yisrael kshera. But on the other hand, we do recognize him as a brother. I mean, in a sense, it works against him as well, because by recognizing him as a son, he's going to be chayiv misa for hakah and klal. But again, I even though that sounds very harsh, but it's like any other brother, any other son. A son who hits his father's chayiv misa, even if the son is a mamzer. And by the way, this leads me to ask another question. And that is kibbud av. Are we saying now that a mamzer is chayav in kibbud vis-a-vis his father? And if he's chayav for klalaso and akaso, then we're recognizing an honors sort of relationship that he has to honor his father. And the greatest violation of that honor would either be to wound his father, Hashem, or to curse his father. And I would assume in that context, he's chayav in kibbud av. My only question about kibbud av is that we should maybe ask another question, whether the father has a status as a Rasha. I mean, leave out tshuva for a moment. Let's say he didn't do tshuva, whatever it is. So the halach is, and it's very complicated because there are different dimensions of kibbud av. Kibbud av is not just like one flat, entity. But fundamentally, there's no kibbud av vis-a-vis a Rasha. Again, the Rambam seems to assume there is, but this whole sugya seems to assume that nobody says anything about the fact the father did tshuva. Now, look how convinced the Gemara is that he is achiv l'chol davar, both for the laws of Yerusha and Tumah, in the case of a Kohen. So the Gemara says, Pshita. In the case of Yibum, we had a whole Havamina that maybe these are not brothers like Bnei Yaakov who are ksherim. But what was the Havamina? That a brother who's a mamzer is considered an ach. He generates Yibum, Tikas Yibum, but yet I have a Havamina that there's no tumah of Kohen in this case. Or maybe there's a Havamina that there's no Yerusha in this case. Why is that so? I would have thought, in the parsha where the Torah allows Kohanim to and obligates Kohanim to be mitami to their krovim, it says ki im l'shei roa karov elav. Okay, fine. In other words, he's not allowed to be mitami himself unless it's she'ero hakarov elav. Yom Amar, the Tana says she'ero zu ishto. So the Torah allows a husband who's a Kohen to be mitame for the burial of his wife, and then afterwards, ksiv lo yitame bal bi'amav lehechalo, which means that a Baal is not allowed to be mitame for his wife, and lehechalo means to desecrate his kedushas kahuna. So there seems to be a head-on contradiction between one part of the pasuk and the other part of the pasuk. Just see, is it actually? I'm looking at the Torah or for a second. No, I think it's not the same. All right. We have a Chumash here by any chance? Yeah, do me a favor, if you can open up just to see Vayikra Perek Chaf Aleph. I think these are two different psukim, but they're, I believe, contiguous one to the other. You find that?
Mm-hmm.
And where does it say Lo Yitama Baal Ba'amav Lehechalo? Is that in the same pasuk?
Mm-hmm. That's the
Next pasuk. Okay. So the Gemara says that in order to reconcile this contradiction, we're going to have to assume Yesh Baal Shemitame. In one scenario, the Baal will be Mitame for the burial of his wife, even though he's a Kohen. Yesh Baal She'eno Mitame. Okay, tzad. Mitame hu le'ishto kshera, v'ein mitame le'ishto psula. And the word psula here means that he had no right to marry this woman. There was a violation of a forbidden marriage. And therefore, with the death of his, so to speak, illegal wife, if you follow, right, he is not allowed to be mitame and be mechal his kedushas kahuna. And that's why it says, Lo yitami bal bi'amo. So we see that there are certain limitations here in the parasha of Tumah with regard to a Kohen and his relatives that touch on the fact that there is a psul in the relationship. Is therefore hachanami in the Havamin, I would have said that mitame hu liach kosher and mitame liach posel. Just like if his wife dies, this Mr. Cohen, it depends whether she was a kosher or posel. And in event that she would, the marriage itself was bipassless, was an isa, let's say she was a divorcee or whatever it might be, then the halacha is that he's not metamila. So in the case of an ach, where there's a psul, the ach is a mamzer. Likewise, I would have thought that he's not metame for his ach, who's not a kosher. For mashmalan, that's what the Mishnah wants to teach me, that it's mutter. So the Gemara asks me, now that you've given me such a cogent argument that would lead me to a conclusion that a Kohen would not be mitami for his brother if his brother is a apostle, Why, Taka, do you tell me that the Mishnah, the Achiv Hu L'chol Davar, that he would be Matami for his brother who's a Mamzer? My answer is we're going to make a distinction between each toe who's a psula and Achiv who's a psula. Achiv who's a mamzer. So let's just cover the Gemara for a moment. I like to play these games and see if we can come up with the distinction and anticipate what the Gemara is going to say. We'll give it a shot. Now, in the case of Ishto, the entire relationship that would generate a chiyuv tuma in the case of a Kohen is the marriage relationship. So if the marriage relation was bekashmus, then the Torah says that you should be mechaliyah kedushas kahuna. But if the marriage itself was a chil of kedushas kahuna, because you had no right to marry this woman, a Kohen is enjoined from marrying a grusha, and he went ahead and married her, then there's a desecration and a chil of kedushas kahuna that's built into the marriage. And such a marriage would not permit. Give me a second because I can't hear myself think here. Okay. Now we got it. I see Sandy is here from the 5 towns. Welcome. Okay. I just put you on mute. I'm sorry. I just want to finish a thought. But in the case of Ach, they are Achim. We saw they're Achim as far as Yibum is concerned. They're Achim as far as Yerusha is concerned. Then why shouldn't they be Achim as far as Tum is concerned? You can't say that there's some sort of a psul in the Achva relationship. And the father may be guilty of a violation here of Erev that made the son into a mamzer. But as far as the two Achim are concerned, well, let's see how the Gemara deals with it. Our answer is Hassam. In the case of his wife who's a psula, lafuke kaima. The Gemara says even better that the ishus must come to a termination, and the halacha will require and obligate the husband who's a kohen to deliver a get to his wife. So again, the kedusha will chal because we're holding like the rabbanon that kedusha tosa b'chayvei lavim, but he's obligated to divorce her. Every moment that he delays divorce, he's violating the Isser of being married to a grusha or zona, halola. And therefore, there's something that makes the Ishus relationship between the husband and the wife into a kind of a temporary quasi-marriage relationship. Because when you have a marriage in the Torah, we discussed this. Let's see if you remember. We discussed this with regard to a sota. That if a man is married to a sota, then since the Torah obligates him to divorce the sota, there's something lacking in the Ishus. And that's why a tzara sota might fall for Yibum. In any event. Hacha, but here in the case of two brothers, Hachivu, in other words, that you can't tell me that the Achva relationship is Batel, meaning he's not going to divorce his brother, as a brother. So whatever Achva there is, there is. And despite the fact that Reuven is a mamzer, there's still an Achva between Reuven and Shimon. Not so in the case of She'era, of his wife, where the halacha is that he has to terminate that marriage. And then go ahead and be Machalis Kedushas Kahuna for the sake of her burial, that's what the Torah excludes.
But is a mamzer Kohen eligible for Truma?
No. Completely excluded. But here we're talking about a different halacha. We're talking about Shimon, who's a full-fledged Kohen Kosher. And for him to bury his brother in this case would mean that he desecrates his Kedushas Kahuna. Is this brother included under the list of relatives for which the Torah says Yitamin?
So maternal brothers are included for...
Ooh, you're asking me a difficult question. Let me see if I remember. You have Rashi there in your Chumash?
Yeah.
Well, that's just an article.
it is.
So I think maybe Rashi mentioned something about it. If not, we need a Torah Tamima. You remember the Torah Tmima?
Yeah.
But let's see if by chance Rashi's here. Uli Achiv. I don't see anything yet.
Because like the unmarried sister, yes, but if she's married, no, so it's kind of like they break that connection between the brother and the sister.
I'm at loss here. I mean, we'd have to. Again, if you want to spend, let's say we'll dedicate 5 minutes to this, then can you get me a Torah Tmima? We'll see. All right, thanks. I don't want to delve too much into this. It's a fascinating sugya, but it's not really our sugya. We're just trying to figure out what the Mishnah meant by saying Achav hu l'chol davam. Chutz mi sheyesh lo ach min hashivcha min alvedes kochavim my taima omer kra yishav yoladea tia ladonel. Okay, so here we're going to have to learn a little bit of Parshas Mishpatim as far as the laws of a shivcha is concerned. The law is that when a Jew is sold as an eved, then the adon, the master, can give him a shivcha, and the children from that relationship between the eved and the shivcha accrue, so to speak, in monetary terms, to the ownership of the adon. Let me just see. You might find here. So first he says la'achiv bein kosher bein posel. So that's our sugya. Let's just see if he, because he quotes him as sugya. Le'achiv li'achiv min ha'av v'lo li'achiv min ha'en. That's head on. I was hoping Rashi would say it, but Tnima points it out, and he says the makshinon libno ulabito, ma bno ubito harayim liyarsho, af achiv haroy liyarsho. Wow, this is fascinating. That the halach of Tumah is very much verbunden, how do you say in English, is very much intertwined with the halach of Yerusha. And just like in Ben Abbas, the halacha is that he's metame to a Ben Abbas because they are his yarshim, so too he's metame to his brother because they are yarshim, one or the other. But Yerusha always goes through the father and not through the mother. And therefore, Achiv min ha'em is not royally yarshim. Oh, then he, again, this is another sugya in Moed Katan. He says, Rabbanon hishvu ach v'achos min ha'em. If you want to learn inheritance laws, this is interesting because there are certain yarshim that are only yaresh midrabanan by virtue of a rabbinic decree, and one of them is going to be achiv min ha'em. Again, for that you really have to learn the laws of Yerusha. Then he says lachoso is achoso min ha'av. So it's his paternal sister, v'lo lachoso min ha'em, but not his maternal sister. Lachoso abesula, pratla nusa umefuta. Okay, so this is already it's also a sugi Masechet Yevamot, but 40 blot from here. So I'm going to give this back to you right now, and that's. And again, I don't know if that answers all your questions,
Yeah.
but
Well, no, I mean, especially because it says more about Yerusha, because I was wondering, who was eligible to have Truma. I mean, if it was an ineligible wife, she couldn't Truma.
right,
She was
for
married
sure.
to the Kohen. The sister, so she got married, was eating Truma. But the mom, but it's more. Makes sense then, all the connection.
Yeah, it's interesting how it ties back to Yerusha. We see it here in the listing of the Gemara. It says the Yarsha Latamilo, but we didn't think that it was, definitely, we didn't think it was Hava Atalia, that one is contingent to the. Okay, now we're talking about how do we derive that Achmin Ashivcha is not considered your brother? My time on Kra. Okay, so let's fill in a little bit of the background for this possible. So we're talking about a Jewish man who was sold as an Eved Ivri, and his master gave him a shivcha, a special heter that the Torah allowed for an Eved Ivri to be married to a shivcha. And now from this shivcha, he has a number of children, let's say. And now it's time for him to terminate his avdus. Let's say an Eved Ivri is usually sold for 6 years. So after 6 years, he goes free. And what about his children? Guess what? The pasuk says, "Ha'isha v'yiladea tia ladoneh." His wife and the children that he had from this wife belonged to the Adon. Now, I don't know why he says here, John, you have the Masechet. What does he mean when he says, Hainu sheha isha shenesua leisha Yisraeli? I thought it was a shift. What does he mean? Isha shenesua leish Yisraeli. Well, what do you have in your translation? Because this throws me for a loop, this line. Do you have, just read the English if you don't want. But Isha v'yiladea tia ladoneh, what does it say?
The woman and her children shall belong to her master.
The woman and her children, does it say? Yeah, okay. Does he embellish it at all? Speak a drop loud. If you don't
I'm trying to get.
Oh, I see.
And slave of servant to be the latter's consort, duration of servitude. The servant goes free. The master retains the slave woman.
Slave woman. Underline those words, slave woman.
Right.
I know in the Masechet it says, Isha shenesua Isha Yisraeli. That's a very ambiguous statement. It should have said, Ashivcha anesua Isha Yisraeli. Okay, fine. Hooray, let me just read the rest of this. You'll read yours. Hooray shayelodim misyachsim acher ha'em v'nisharim avodim. So all this remains in the Bible, the ownership of the Adon. V'eno misyachsim acher ha'em. Because if the children from that shivcha would be miyuchas to the father, then they would go free together with their father. Okay. Now we have a few minutes left before I let you go. And we got up to Yud Aleph here in the Yalkut HaBiurim. I'm sorry, up to Yud Beis, I think we got up to. And this might whet us whet our appetite to go back to the issue of Shnios Larayos, which, as I told you, there are like 3 pages here of diagrams and explanations to the diagrams. So it says here, Mutter Adam bi Eshes Chamiv. So a man is allowed to marry the wife of his father-in-law. Right? So it means his wife has a father, right? The father-in-law, and he has a wife. And let's say after he divorces her or after he dies, then he would be allowed to marry that woman. And the Ramban is going to try to analyze, why was there a Havamina here that maybe it should be us? And in the context of this Ramban, he's going to raise the question, what's the status of a daughter that was married, that was born to his father-in-law? Are you with me, Rabbosai? So his father-in-law has a daughter. Can he marry his father-in-law's daughter? And the answer is, for sure, he cannot, because she is Achos Ishto, correct? And yet, he can marry her mother. So Ramban writes, "Be'emes lo hoya tanet tzorch l'shanos heta b'yeshes chamav, kevin shekol ma'asher lo shonu chacham le'isarei muteres." We have a rule here that in the listing of the Brysos, we had different listings, and Rav Chia had another 6, and all those numbers there. That is the exhaustive list of Shnios Larayos. And Eshes Chamiv is not on that list. So we understand very well that he's allowed to marry Eshes Chamiv. Yet the Bryso went out of its way to tell her, Mutar Odom Eshes Chamiv. So first he says, we have a principle called Shir, right? The Bryso did not mention the 6 categories that Rabbi Chia added. Oh, so now you have you have a Pandora's box, or they call it a worm's. That maybe Eshes Chamiv was left out. Oh, but what was the logic? Why we might have entertained the idea that Eshes Chamiv should be prohibited b'Torah Shnios Larayos? He says, Mistaber Lomar Kain. Why would I think that if the Tana left out certain cases like the 6 categories of Rabbi Chia, it left out also Eshes Chamiv? Kevan shebita shel Eshes Chamiv. Asura mipnei shehi achotz ishto, the daughter of his father-in-law, well, again, it's less important as the father-in-law than the stepmother-in-law, if you follow what I mean. That's his father-in-law married a woman, and that woman, I don't know if in English you would say this, is a stepmother-in-law. Can you use that term? She is the mother of his wife's sister. So the daughter of the stepmother-in-law is Achos Ishto. In Cain, says the Ramban, Hech Efshar Shehi Tia Asura Ubito Muteres. Not sure the language here bothers me. I don't know. I can't make out the words, but I understand what the Ramban is saying. I just can't fit it into the words. The Ramban is saying that it's very paradoxical that the daughter of this woman is an Ereva, but the mother is Muteres. We always have a principle in Shnios Larayos that it goes up and down, all the generations. So if this woman is Asura to me, then her mother is Asura to me. Right? Let's say, for example, Imo. So then we have shniyos of aim imo. Or, for example, what other examples? Yeah, right, we have bito, and then we have bas bito. It always goes up and down the generations. And if you're telling me that the daughter of this woman is an erva because she's achos ishto, then it would make sense that her mother is a shniya larayas. That's what I think the Ramban is saying. Hence, we need the Brisa to spell it out explicitly. Umutar adam b'eshes chama, because the daughter of eshes chama is achos ishta. L'chein hutzah chatana l'shanas beheja explicitly b'eshes chama muteres. I mean, now the words of the Ramban flow, but I don't know that other line is a little bit. V'zeu gam masha omru l'kamon da'atam v'ktoni shebas chorgo asura umishum aseifa d'katoni eshes chorgo. Eshes chorgo omereslo ani muteres lecha ubiti asur lecha. Second, Eshes Chargo. And so he has a stepson, let's say his wife's son from a previous marriage, and his wife's son got married. That becomes his daughter-in-law through his wife. In other words, it's not really his daughter-in-law, but his wife had a son from a different husband, a different marriage, and the wife of that son, which is Eshes Chargo, is Asura. Just 1 second. Okay, now we get to Bas Churgo, or not Eshes Churgo, but Bas Churgo, which means that his wife has a son from another marriage, and that son has a daughter. And the language of the Gemara to explain the Seifa is that Eshes Churgo Mereslo, Ani Muteres Lecho Bite Asura Lecho. How could it be that the daughter of his stepson is Asura, but her mother is Muteres? So you see again that logic, says the Ramban, that if the daughter is Asura, then certainly the mother becomes Asura. Okay, so that's, I think, where we'll stop for today. Let's see where we got up to. I'll make a note of it, and then we'll have it. Okay, Rabosai, so have a great day. Good to be back.